Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 25 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Each week, we sit down with an historian to discuss their unique insights into our early American past so we can learn more about who we are and how we can affect a better future. Wow, I don't know about you, but I cannot believe we are already on episode 25. Time has just flown by as we have covered so much great history and chatted with so many wonderful historians. But do you know what? There is so much more history for us to cover and so many more fantastic historians to talk to. So I think we're going to keep going. Today, we head back to colonial America to the age of the First Great Awakening with Jessica Parr, an historian who studies early modern Atlantic and religious history. Jessica will introduce us to one of the most visible figures in British North America between the 1740s and 1770, the Reverend George Whitefield, a central figure in the transatlantic revivalist movement and a man whose legacy remains influential to evangelical Christians today. During our conversation, Jessica reveals who George Whitefield was and why he was an important person in early American religious history, what the First Great Awakening was, and how that event affected the religious landscape of early America, and where George Whitefield fit into that landscape, and what George Whitefield thought about slavery, and how his views influenced ideas about that institution. Just a note on pronunciation. When we begin our conversation with Jessica, you may note that I pronounce George Whitefield's name as George Whitefield, and that's because it is spelled George Whitefield, but as Jessica pointed out to me, he pronounced his name George Whitefield, so please forgive my mispronunciation. I did try to correct that, but his name is pronounced George Whitefield, but spelled Whitefield. Now, before we get to today's episode, I would like to ask you to stick around until the very end of the episode, because at the end, I have something very special I would like to share with you. Now, I'm not going to tell you what it is right now. I know I'm such a tease, but it involves the very first Ben Franklin's World in-person meetup. Okay, are you ready to explore the interesting life of George Whitefield? Allow me to introduce you to Jessica Parr.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Jessica Parr specializes in early modern Atlantic history. She has a particular interest in the history of religion and the transatlantic slave trade. Jessica teaches history at the University of New Hampshire, Manchester, and Emmanuel College. And she just published her first book, Inventing George Whitefield, Race, Revivalism, and the Making of a Religious Icon. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Jessica.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
Congratulations on the publication of your first book.
Thank you. It's exciting.
Yeah, I have to say, as someone who is revising her dissertation into her first book, I am both envious that you were finished and inspired that you did finish.
Finish is definitely a good feeling.
So would you tell us a bit about yourself and how you became interested in the early modern Atlantic history? And would you tell us what the term early modern covers?
I became interested in Atlantic history while I was working on an MA thesis on maritime history at Simmons College in Boston. My interests were solidified when I was a PhD student at the University of New Hampshire in Durham, and I was working under the supervision of Elijah Gould. The early modern period begins at the late 15th century or early 16th century, depending on who you ask, of course, and it goes to about 1800.
So how did you come to the study of George Whitefield, the focus of your first book? Would you tell us who he is and why he's an important person in early American history?
Sure. Well, this project actually began as an interest in baptism and slavery. In the early English world, there was actually no specific law that made slavery legal. So they had to work their way through a bunch of different law and religious and other mechanisms to more clearly define slavery. Slavery in English tradition tended to have political connotations rather than the social and legal status that the slave trade became. And as I worked through some research at the Lambeth Palace Library in London, I started to come across Whitefield's name a fair amount. And what happened was that I had wanted to write a book on Whitefield and baptism, except that the documents weren't there for it to be a full book project. So it got blown up into a larger project about who Whitefield was and included race as a part of that, his role in the slave trade. Whitefield was an Anglican minister who was a central figure of the First Great Awakening. He was born in Gloucester, England in December 1714, and he died in Newburyport, Massachusetts in September 1770, rather suddenly. He was a figure of transatlantic revivalism, but his missionary career was critical to the spreading of revivalism to the British North American colonies.
Your book is about the invention of George Whitefield. Let's start at the beginning of his religious mission. While attending Pembroke College in Oxford, England, Whitefield met Charles and John Wesley, the founders of Methodism. Would you tell us the story of how he met them and what effect the Wesleys had on Whitefield's spiritual life?
Well, Whitefield was originally a natural sciences major when he was at Pembroke College. He got there right around, I believe, 1735. He was a servitor, which is one of the most humble of all positions in the college, meaning that he made his tuition cleaning his wealthier classmates' shoes, picking up after them, and in many cases doing their homework for them. He met the Wesleys through kind of an unusual circumstances. He knew who they were because they had started a club called the Holy Club when they were students at Christ College in Oxford in around 1732, and used to be regular figures in downtown Oxford at church meetings and preaching and whatnot. So Whitefield was aware of him. And then one day when he was a student, Whitefield got word of a suicide attempt by a young female laborer and decided to send word to the Wesleys because he thought the woman could use spiritual guidance. And despite begging the servant of Pembroke College that he sent to not reveal who had told them, the servant told Charles Wesley, and George Whitefield was invited to breakfast the next morning to join them. And they struck up a friendship. John and Charles Wesley became sort of mentors of sorts to him. They lent him theological text from their enormous library, which was a big boon for a young man of limited means, including main revivalist texts like Henry Scougal and William Law. He was a regular in their meetings. He became a theology major actually because of their influence and really turned to religious life. And also, they were the inspiration for his first missionary trip, when he went to Savannah, Georgia in 1738. The Wesleys had been there first and had sort of a disastrous and somewhat scandalous turn, but Whitefield was really intrigued by all the letters that he wrote home, and he came to the conclusion that America would be a wonderful school to learn Christ in, and then I'm paraphrasing here, but he really saw going to the colonies as a calling. So they were hugely influential on his career.
Was Methodism a formal religion when Whitefield met the Wesleys, or were they still part of the Anglican Church?
The Methodist movement, and I should hasten to add that in this period, Methodism was a pejorative term, as were many terminologies that were used to describe religious denominations. Methodism was a movement. It was sort of seen as a reform movement, and actually it was considered undesirable to break from the Church of England. So officially, John and Charles Wesley, George Whitefield, all of these early figures in the Methodist movement would have considered themselves Anglican, but they had this doctrine that was clearly inconsistent with the Church of England, as well as some practices, more Whitefield than some of the others, and included things like itinerant preaching, the rejection of not using the Book of Common Prayer, the extemporaneous preaching, the preaching across denominational lines, and especially the regeneration that was completely inconsistent with Church of England doctrine. And the church didn't officially split from the Anglican Church until 1790. And this was about 3 years after Charles Wesley died. He died in 1788. And a couple of months after John Wesley died, he died in 1791, in March of 1791. And of course, Whitefield had been dead for 20 years at that point.
So I was going to ask you about regeneration later, but since you brought it up, it seemed that the idea of new birth or regeneration is one of the ideas that made Whitefield so popular in early America. Could you tell us what that doctrine was? And also, if they're not using the Book of Common Prayer, what are they using to lead their prayers with?
Okay, well, why don't I start with a little overview of what the new birth or regeneration is. The new birth comes from the book of John, chapter 3, and it's a story where Jesus explains to Nicodemus that the new birth is about a spiritual rebirth, which revivalists described as a conversion experience. So Whitefield and his fellow revivalists believe that the followers experienced a conversion experience and they were born into a new spiritual life. And this is really a central part of Whitefield's message. Reception by early Americans was kind of mixed, but he didn't really lack for supporters. It was not unusual for his sermons to draw thousands, if not tens of thousands of people, and this has actually been corroborated by somebody who is working on sound engineering at NYU. Ulio de Equiano's narrative describes a scene in Philadelphia church where people are supposedly up on ladders peering through church windows to get a better viewpoint. And there's a diary from a New Englander who attended one of Whitefield's services during his first visit and noted that so many people tried to cram themselves into a church pew that his pew buckled and broke under them, leaving them bruised. As far as what they used, rather than the Book of Common Prayer, they used the sermons largely that they had written themselves. A lot of times they were done extemporaneously rather than prepared in advance. But then Whitefield especially became very prolific about writing these sermons down and publishing them so they could be further disseminated throughout the British Atlantic world. And as part of what helped him sort of sell his popularity.
So Whitefield was kind of like a colonial rock star. People just flocked to see him because they were just, he seemed charismatic.
Absolutely, yes. He was very charismatic. There are, in fact, some political cartoons that show especially women sort of gazing up to him adoringly and salaciously, which, of course, were done in part by his critics to poke fun at Whitefield.
Now, you mentioned he published his sermons, and actually, I think in the book you mentioned that he published over 18,000 texts during his lifetime. What types of texts, other than sermons, did Whitefield publish, and how did his writing help him further his missionary work and public image?
Well, I would say that Whitefield's most well-known publications were probably of his journals, which began with his childhood and after his second missionary voyage to the colonies. They depict a young man who came from a humble beginning, having been born at his family's inn in Gloucester, England. And there are obviously some parallels there. He's sort of implying the Christmas story. They detail his turn to religious life while he was a student at Pembroke College, as well as his early career. And much of what is known about Whitfield's early life actually comes from these journals. So big historical impact there, although, of course, historians have to be careful knowing that most of what we know about Whitefield comes from Whitefield himself, and Whitefield was hugely conscious of his public image. But more than that, there are some real biblical undertones, as Whitefield painted himself as a model of religious redemption for his prospective audience. For the religious listeners, there's also some influences in St. Paul in the way he presented himself. Whitefield also published and sold his sermons, sometimes his own correspondence. He was quite fond of threatening to publish correspondence with people he'd had a quarrel with, especially bishops, and you can imagine how well that went over. Historian Frank Lambert calls Whitefield a peddler in divinity, and it's a reference to the scale with which Whitefield used not only preaching, but the sale of his written materials to self-promote and to build anticipation for his visits. The British and colonial newspapers were full of advertisements for things like the latest Whitefield sermon or news of a forthcoming or recent visit. And as I looked through these sources, I suspect that it's pretty likely at least some of these items were the work of Whitefield himself, although they're unsigned.
Was the way that Whitefield portrayed himself, like St. Peter, like Jesus, was that by coincidence, or did he work towards portraying those images?
He worked toward it. What Whitefield wanted to do, in addition to spreading his religious message, is that he wanted to project himself not only as a model of piety, but also as a model of somebody who, in his description, was sinful and overcame that background. He describes a youthful experience when he was a teenager, playing cards, being involved in the theater, which was considered sinful, and temptation. He talks about stealing from his mother. So not only does he have he wants to be projected as a model of piety, but he's also trying to give potential converts hope, because he's talking about how he overcame a somewhat, checkered past.
And you mentioned that he kept journals. Mm-hmm. Did they happen to mention what Whitefield thought when he first arrived in the colonies? Because he was born in England, and many people who come from Europe kind of shocked at what they see. Did he have a similar reaction?
Well, I think that he saw the colonies as a blank slate, of sorts, especially Georgia. One of the interesting things about colonial Georgia is that, unlike other colonies, missionaries didn't need to have a license, and that's permission from the Bishop of London to preach there. So he saw this as this blank slate that he could really work with and have a huge impact on religious culture and religious life. He did note in his journals about how there are some people who are deeply conflicted because there are so many different denominations in colonial Georgia, which started in part as a charitable colony. It had a lot of people from fleeing religious persecution from Europe, including the Salzburger Germans. So Whitefield had that potential audience, but also because there are so many different choices, Whitefield expressed frustration that sometimes his audience wasn't as receptive as he would like. And in fact, there was one man who basically was on his deathbed and said, I don't know what to choose. There's so many choices, and I'm not sure what the right religious path is. And Whitefield ultimately wound up refusing to administer the last rites over him because he couldn't get the man to profess the faith that Whitefield was after. The other thing that he observed, and this goes to why he later supported slavery in colonial Georgia, he noticed that the colony was dirt poor, it was underdeveloped. It really, really struggled, especially in comparison with its northern neighbor in South Carolina, which was a rich slaveholding colony, and that was not lost on Whitefield. So those are sort of some of the things that he noticed early in his tenure in the colonies.
I want to talk about Whitefield's position on slavery, but just before we move on, we've talked about how he tried to craft his image in the form of St. Peter, in the form of Jesus. He tried to be this example of piety, and he had this desire to spread religion, and he had a very charismatic way of doing it. So all of this stuff adds up to him being someone that people wanted to see and hear preach. But it also seemed like part of his fame came from his timing. He arrived in the colonies during the First Great Awakening. And I wonder if you would provide us with a brief overview of what the First Great Awakening was and how that movement affected the early American religious landscape.
Oh, sure. Well, the First Great Awakening was a religious movement that starts around 1730 in New England. It's a revivalist movement, meaning that the people who are associated with it hope to revive interest in religious life. The revivalist movement, the First Great Awakening, lasts about until the middle of the 18th century, but Whitefield is actually seen as a key figure in the revivalism's popularity. A lot of interest in revivalism uncoincidentally takes off because of Whitefield. And obviously he's not the only preacher of the First Great Awakening. So, we have the Wesleys, we have Jonathan Edwards, who is popular, although he didn't move around quite as much as Whitefield did. There's Isaac Watts. There are a couple of different figures, but because Whitefield was so mobile and so visible, he becomes kind of a figurehead of this First Great Awakening.
I could see how he'd be a very popular guy in a place that's already fairly religious.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about slavery, which is what initially brought you to study George Whitefield. It seemed to me that Whitefield preached in a way that both criticized slavery and defended slavery. So would you tell us what his actual stance on slavery was?
Sure. Well, let's start with a little bit of an overview. The slave trade provoked a number of wars in Africa, in part because one of the ways that traders got the slaves was by encouraging Africans to fight and to sell prisoners of war. What Whitefield was actually criticizing was not so much the institution itself, but he was raising some potential moral issues about the method of gathering slaves, and it's something that he kind of got over fairly quickly. Whitefield came to see slave ownership as a pragmatic solution to economic and logistic problems in the settlement of colonial Georgia, where the owning of African slaves was initially illegal. And he became heavily involved in trying to convince the trustees of Georgia to change their minds. He's considered important to the campaign, which was ultimately successful, and African slavery was legalized in Georgia in 1752. He, as many pro-slavery Christians did, saw himself as a benevolent master, one who looked after his slaves' spiritual well-being as well as their physical needs. One of the problems for Whitefield is that in 1739 he published a fairly scathing letter to Southern planters in which he roundly criticized them for the way they treated their slaves, although I should say he was particularly critical of those who failed to provide religious instructions for their slaves, and that to him was almost worse than the way they treated the slaves. And in big planter colonies like South Carolina, he's often seen as hypocritical for both owning slaves and also at the same time criticizing the behavior of their slave owners. And part of that is that he saw the slave owners' lifestyle as extravagant, and Whitefield was very much anti-extravagance.
Can you just talk about how Whitefield saw slavery as an economic solution to poverty in Georgia? Because my understanding of the founding of Georgia is that it began as a place of reform. It's where they sent some prisoners from the overcrowding jails, for people that were deemed vagrants. And the idea behind it was if they go to Georgia and we give them some land, they'll work the land and then they'll reform their lives and live these virtuous, productive lives.
Sure. Well, the idea of having African slaves was pretty controversial. James Oglethorpe, who was one of the early founders, of course, of Georgia, didn't really want to see colonists become reliant on slaves because they thought it would make them soft. And there was a big debate back and forth about whether European indentured servants and prisoners would better employers or better workers than African slaves. But the problem was twofold. First of all, there weren't enough white settlers to do all the work that was needed to do to clear Georgia, to farm Georgia, and to make it economically viable. The second thing that was a problem is, and I saw this in the debate back and forth, is that people who were proponents of slavery saw the Europeans as weaker workers, not as hard workers, less inclined to be able to handle the Georgia climate. So basically all of the sort of racist language that you typically see that's used to justify the use of slaves, that they're more suited to the climate, and so on and so forth. And one of the problems with Georgia is, again, that it was nowhere near as wealthy as South Carolina. So whether or not slaves could actually save the colonies, the people who advocated bringing slaves into Georgia noted the use of slaves in South Carolina. So the perception was there that slaves would make things better. And in fact, there were a lot of early settlers who could afford it who were moving to South Carolina over this very issue. You start to see people leaving colonial Georgia in droves.
So I know this is a tough question because, today we know slavery to be an evil and it was a horrific institution. But did the introduction of slavery actually make things better in the eyes of the early Georgians? Did it improve the economy of Georgia?
Well, Whitefield, when he got the news about colonial Georgia being allowed to have slaves, he said, under God, the providence will flourish. So he saw it as a big positive. It looks like the colony did actually improve. I mean, a lot of the early economy was utterly dependent on slavery. Georgia never quite reached the same amount of wealth as South Carolina did, though.
So Whitefield really defends the institution of slavery. He sees it as an economic good. And this seems interesting to me because he still, even with his stance on slavery, his preaching still had a profound impact on slaves and Native Americans. So would you tell us about the impact he had on African-American poet Phillis Wheatley and on the Native American minister Samson Occom?
Sure. I'll start with a description of who these people are. Phillis Wheatley was an African-American slave who was owned by John and Susanna Wheatley, who are two deeply religious and wealthy Bostonians. Wheatley became a celebrated poet and writer in the 1770s, as well as a key figure in the early anti-slavery movement. Wheatley was somebody who's associated with the Methodist movement and had met Whitefield through her mistress, Susan Wheatley, who purchased Wheatley as a child, about 7 or 8 years old. Wheatley was not the only literate or educated Black Bostonian, but she had access to an education that would have been unusual even for a lot of white Americans at that time, even in New England. It allowed the Wheatley family to show off their piety as well as their Christian charity that they could afford to educate their slaves. And Wheatley herself was quite religious and had met Whitefield a number of times. She became famous at the age of around 17, where she penned a famous elegy to Whitefield after his death in 1770. Her elegy actually celebrates Whitefield as a spiritual savior to Americans. And I'll just read a brief clip from her elegy. It says, "Where his Americans were burdened sore, when streets were crimsoned in their guiltless gore, unrivaled friendship in his breast now strove, the fruit thereof was charity and love. Towards America couldst thou do more than leave thy native home, the British shore, to cross the great Atlantic's watery road, to see America's distress abode." Now, Samson Occom was a Native American of Mohegan extract. He was a Presbyterian minister from Connecticut who was among the first Native American missionaries to publish his writings. Occam converted as a teenager under the influence of Connecticut minister James Davenport, and then studied at Eleazar Whitlock's New London Indian School, which is the precursor for Dartmouth College. He was initially ordained by the New Light Calvinist sect in 1756 and became Presbyterian in 1759 after studying and passing an exam. When Whitefield was in the colonies for his sixth missionary tour, Occam accompanied him for at least part of it, if not all of it. He then accompanied Whitefield on a charitable tour back in England. During this tour, Occam actually became very disaffected with his mentor, Wheelock, who he came to see as not really looking out for Native American interests. Among other things, Wheelock hadn't kept his promise to see to the needs of Occam's wife and kids while he was in England, and he also broke another promise, and he moved his Connecticut Indian School to Hanover, New Hampshire, this is the founding of Dartmouth College, and then it became, as Occam feared, rather exclusionary towards Native Americans. And I found some correspondence between Wheelock and Whitefield, where Whitefield was actually feeding Occam's concerns about and validating Occam's concerns about Wheelock's behavior.
As we've acknowledged, Wheatley and Occam are exceptional. I mean, they had access to education that most slaves and Native Americans did not have, and they were both from the North. So do you have any evidence, or can we know if Whitefield had a similar impact on slaves and Native Americans who didn't have the same access to education or who lived in other regions other than New England and the Northeast?
Well, he was definitely influential to a number of early Black preachers, including Andrew Bryan and also George Lau. And the problem with some of these other ministers is that we know that they're there, but they're big figureheads in the early Black church. And these guys were preaching very much at the peril of themselves. So the church has moved around for obvious reasons outside of any literacy. They didn't keep records because if they were found out, they were taking a big risk. So we do know that he was influential to some other ministers, another from the South and also from the Mid-Atlantic area. They're just, unfortunately, many of them are just not quite as well documented as Occam or Wheatley.
So Whitefield dies in 1770. I think you mentioned it was in September 1770 in Newburyport, Massachusetts. And he's entombed underneath the pulpit of the Newburyport Presbyterian Church. But he was nominally both an Anglican and an Englishman. So how did George Whitefield come to be interred in the Newburyport Presbyterian Church?
Well, Whitefield's visit in New England in 1742 was actually fairly instrumental in the founding of that church, which broke off from another religious society in Newburyport. But more importantly, it's kind of a matter of geography. He was actually staying in the parsonage when he died very suddenly in September 1770. Some say it was an asthma attack, in part because accounts of his death have Whitefield crying out, my asthma, and others have said that it was a heart attack, which was not unlikely given that he was kind of a corpulent figure towards the end of his life. The pastor and others who attended his death actually said that Whitefield himself indicated that he wanted to be buried under the pulpit there, which may or may not be true, but obviously not to get macabre here, but there are certain expeditious needs to bury people where they pass away in the 18th century. So some of it may have been convenience too.
There's no embalming, is there?
No, embalming is really, at least for the United States, it's a Civil War phenomenon.
How did people remember Whitefield after his death? Because it seems to me, after reading your book, like many groups tried to adopt his memory and image for their cause, and that his tomb actually became a pilgrimage site for many Protestants, regardless of their denominations.
Well, because Whitefield was an itinerant who tended to ignore denominational lines when seeking out recipients for his religious messages, his legacy is actually pretty complex. And that's one of the things that makes him an interesting historical figure to study. Beginning pretty much immediately after his death, many of his supporters began publishing elegies and memoirs, which were intended to preserve his religious messages, his image as a pious man, but also to defend his memory against critics. African-American Phyllis Wheatley was one. John Gillies, who was, I believe, an Englishman, was another. His memoir has served as an important primary source for many people who have written about Whitefield, although it's problematic in part because it emphasizes his career in the colonies, and it's one of the reasons why he's often claimed as an American figure, despite his death in 1770, before there was a United States, and the fact that he had a huge following in UK and Europe. There were also reprints of his journals and his sermons and translations. Although not everything made it in the book, I found evidence of new translations in the early 1770s and 1780s of his sermons into Welsh, German, Scottish Gaelic, and other languages. Aside from this mass movement to preserve and defend his religious legacy, his memory was also invoked in the growing debate over whether slavery was compatible with Christian morals. For instance, Franco-American Quaker Anthony Benezet wrote to Whitefield's executress and friend, the Countess of Huntington, and evoked some of Whitefield's own criticisms of the treatment of slaves from his infamous letter to Southern planters in an effort to try to get her to free Whitefield's considerable number of slaves, which he had not only at his Bethel House mission as an orphanage in Savannah, Georgia, but he also had a sizable plantation in South Carolina. The Countess ultimately rebuffed Benezet, more or less telling him that, we're going to let God decide whether slavery is moral or not. For American evangelicals, during the American Revolution and afterward, he becomes a critical figure in the way they envision the new American piety, but he remains influential to evangelicals overseas. Whitefield's tomb became a pilgrimage site of sorts. It was visited by Protestant missionaries of many different stripes, from Free Will Baptists to Methodist, as well as famous figures like Benedict Arnold with some Continental troops before Arnold went over to the other side. Before the tomb was sealed in 1930, the taking of souvenirs was not uncommon, and sometimes there was a theft of parts of his remains. And of course, in my first chapter, I described the theft of an arm bone by an English pilgrim and then its subsequent return months later. There are claims that a thumb bone is in the archives at Drew University in the UK, although I'm not sure if testing has been done to confirm that it's actually Whitefield's. And then in the 19th century, some of these visits involved sort of a ritualistic, almost Shakespeare-esque handling of Whitefield's skull as pilgrims prayed over his remains, sort of like they're trying to draw spiritual energy from him.
He does not have had a very peaceful existence.
No, not at all.
Well, on that pleasant note, let's transition to the time warp.
Okay.
This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Are you ready for your time warp question, Jessica?
Yes.
So in your opinion, what might have happened if George Whitefield had lived beyond 1770 and through the American Revolution? Do you think he would have been a patriot, a loyalist, or someone who tried to maintain a neutral course? And what effect do you think he would have had on the course of the revolution?
Well, I think it's difficult to say, not to sound all wishy-washy here. And I think it's because the revolution was far from a foregone conclusion when he died in 1770. And it's important to remember that the decision to declare independence was really not an easy one. Even figures that we strongly associate with the American side, like George Washington, even sought to avoid war up to the last moment. Washington was even signing letters to King George III Your Majesty's most loyal subject. So Whitefield did admittedly spend quite a bit of his adult life touring the British North American colonies, but he wasn't really a permanent resident. And Whitefield was also somebody whose primary concern was with spiritual matters rather than politics. So it's very possible that he would have been sympathetic to the colonists, although many of his friends, James Habersham, Selina, the Countess of Huntington, were loyalists. I do think that had he been alive, he would undoubtedly have been inspirational, even more so, to evangelical Americans as far as forming their visions of what American religious culture would look like. But I think he was more powerful as a symbol in death and in life, which is one of the big points that I make in my book. So unfortunately, I think it's difficult to say. If I really had to be pinned down, I have a feeling he would have tried to remain neutral to continue to preserve as much of an audience for himself as possible.
Well, the beauty of the time warp is there's no right or wrong answer because we can't know. We can only speculate. So thank you for giving that a try. So would you tell us about what aspect of history you are researching and writing about now?
Sure. Well, I'm at the early stages of a couple of book projects. The one that's currently the furthest along is on religion, repentant language, and self-making in the Black Atlantic. In the 18th century Atlantic world, Christianity is often contrasted with heathenism as a proto-racial language of sorts. Our modern ideas of race are something that doesn't really solidify until around the 1780s. I noted that several catechized Black writers, including Phyllis Wheatley and Ulloa Equiano, contrasted their converted state against the paganness of Africa. I am looking at the writings of Black Christians, including Wheatley, to determine whether religiously based proto-racial language informs social structures in the African diaspora and to what extent.
Wow, that sounds like quite the project.
It should keep me busy for a while.
Where's the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you?
Well, I am a regular contributor to the Junto, which is an academic history blog. The blog's URL is earlyamericanist.com, and listeners can find a profile on me there. I can also be reached via my LinkedIn and academia.edu profiles, or my Twitter handle, which is @ProvAtlantic. Prov is capital and Atlantic is capital.
And we'll include links to those places in the show notes page for this show. So, Jessica, thank you so much for joining us here on Ben Franklin's World and talking all about George Whitefield.
Well, thank you.
It must have been something to hear George Whitefield preach. Whitefield's powerful and enthusiastic preaching inspired many colonial Americans to join the transatlantic revivalist movement during the First Great Awakening. His oratory was so powerful that he inspired African Americans like Phyllis Wheatley, even when Whitefield supported and defended the institution of slavery. And the power of Whitefield's preaching caused many abolitionists and the proponents of other causes to want to use Whitefield's memory to further their missions long after his death. And even today, the legacy of George Whitefield lives on and remains influential to evangelical Christians. So I'm glad Jessica came on to talk about this very important individual. You can find more information about Jessica, her new book, Inventing George Whitefield, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, which you'll find at benfranklinsworld.com/025. And now for my exciting announcement. Have you planned your summer vacation yet? I hope you will consider Boston. 2015 marks the 250th anniversary of the Stamp Act, and August 2015 marks the 250th anniversary of the Boston Stamp Act riots. I wanted to do something special for you and to commemorate this important event. So I have teamed up with Boston by Foot to offer a special tour of Boston that will focus on the Stamp Act riots as well as the city's role during the American Revolution. Now, I can't provide you with too many details at this point because I haven't written the tour yet, but I can tell you that the tour will take place on Saturday, August 15, 2015. I can also tell you that Boston by Foot will provide enough guides so that everyone who signs up for this tour will be able to take it. Now, with that said, space on my particular tour will be limited because Boston by Foot tries to keep our groups manageable, and so that number works out to about 15 or 20 people. If you are interested in this special tour of Boston, please be sure to sign up for the Franklin Gazette newsletter at benfranklinsworld.com, as that will be the first place I announce when and where you can register for our special Stamp Act and Revolutionary Boston tour. I hope you will consider making this trip. I would really like to meet you and show you both my hometown and my favorite city in person, and it is always so much fun to spend the day talking about the American Revolution and early American history with people who love it. Finally, have you ever made a pilgrimage to an historic figure's gravesite? If so, who did you visit, and where is their gravesite located? Email me your answers, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, or tweet me @LizCovart.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.